So, good afternoon or good morning. I never know which to say at 1 o'clock. But anyway, a very warm welcome to EPC Update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. And as always, we have a huge amount to discuss at the moment as we consider a world turned upside down. What are the implications for Europe, for its economic and political model of recent developments, most strikingly, of course, including that shock announcement last week of Donald Trump's tariffs on almost every country that exports to the US, including 20% blanket tariffs on EU products, adding to those already imposed for cars, steel and aluminium. We're going to talk about what all of that means. We're also going to talk about whether we see any connection between this and the ongoing conversations about the future of Ukraine and Europe's role in Ukraine. As always, it's going to be a totally interactive discussion with questions from me and I hope from all of you by clicking on the Q&A button and writing it or raising your hands. And with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, who is Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. So lots to talk about. Let us jump straight in, and things indeed evolving as we talk. Markets opening, markets moving, foreign ministers meeting, a lot going, finance ministers also meeting, a lot going on. But Fabian, let me come to you first in terms of the EU's response so far since those tariffs were announced last week. It has been, some have called it stuttering, some have simply said it's muted, some have suggested it's very wise, they're trying to project an air of calm and not panicking, thinking things through carefully before they respond, others seeing it as a sign of weakness and an inability to agree. What is your assessment of the response and the key factors driving it?
I think firstly, we have to say it's difficult to know how to respond because it is unprecedented. What we've just seen is the cancellation of decades-long principles which have guided international trade by the biggest economy, by the main proponent of that system. So it isn't surprising that there is a consideration of how best to respond to this kind of situation and a level of disagreement. I would say that up to now, the EU has done rather well. It has not panicked, but it is also standing firm. But this is a process. This is going to be a question over weeks, over months, also with always the possibility of an escalation if the EU responds. So it's going to be a difficult process. And yes, of course, there are different interests also on the EU side. Different parts of the economy are being hit differently. Just for example, having the 25% on the automotive sector has a very different effect in different countries.
Just to follow up on that, and then I'll come to you, Janis. You say it's done rather well by not panicking, but that would be to assess, for example, Canada's response when tariffs were slapped on Canada and responded very quickly and very firmly, but it wasn't characterized as panicking. I'm interested that you think this calm response is the right one. Why?
Well, I think firstly, there is a very clear statement that there will be a response. So this is not a question of the EU saying we're going to try to accommodate this, but it's a question of the EU saying we are going to get together and we're going to decide what the appropriate response is. So I think that's important. I think what Canada had to do was also given its situation at that moment in time. It was very much singled out together with Mexico. There was the whole context of Canada being threatened in its existence, being threatened of becoming part of the United States. So a very firm response also had to be taken for that political reason, which is different for the EU.
Okay, we'll come back on that in a moment. But Janis, would you agree with Fabian that this is the wise, the cautious approach is the right one at this stage?
Yes, I think we need to be wise and cautious, which actually is a sign of strength. Because if you look at how Liberation Day was done, how it was constructed, how it was conceived, what is the motivation behind it, there are people who have called this, voodoo economics. It's not only that it is unprecedented, it's also done in a way which is very amateurish. It is, I think, from the perspective of the US itself, very short term, but also in the mid to long term, it is not in the interest of the US, of what has been done, how it is being done. Let's not also forget that there are already a strong opposition within the US itself. Also, by the way, differences of opinion close to Trump. If you listen to Elon Musk, for example, who's increasingly, for some at least, is becoming a persona non grata also within the inner circles. So there's also the situation developing in the US itself. So we should also be aware of what actually is happening all across the Atlantic and take that into account.
So are you saying...
Now you could say, because you didn't mention the Chinese, who obviously also reacted extremely 34%. Strongly. But let's not forget one thing. And that is something which he has already done, Trump, and he will be doing also strongly in the upcoming days and weeks, that there's also a link to the situation in Ukraine. It's related to Europe's security. It relates to something where we need the Americans, at least to some extent, for at least some period of time. So wisdom is not only related to the economics of all this, it's also related to the politics and the geopolitics of it.
And interesting that link you mentioned.
I think we need to link it to all these different aspects.
Okay. Interesting you mentioned that link with Ukraine, because when members of the Trump administration were asked over the weekend why no tariffs on Russia, they said because they're in the middle of negotiations and we don't want to disrupt the delicate balance. But there are tariffs on Ukraine, rather undermining that argument. But are you basically therefore, Janis, saying one argument people are saying is look at the chaos in the stock markets right around the world, and that political turmoil you referred to within the US, increasing divisions on this among Republicans. Are you saying in essence that might do our job for us?
In some ways, potentially, yes. However, and that's why I would be cautious, we should not be naive and expect that now he will turn around, that he will not be ready to push things also in other areas, by the way. So let's not be naive. What is the main lesson since January, for me at least, is that you need to expect the worst and prepare for the worst. But you need to do it in a way which takes into the equation the politics of it, which relates to, by the way, also the politics among the EU 27, because we also have differences among the 27 if you look into also reactions coming from various member states, but also the politics in the US and also the international global politics. So also, how others are positioning themselves might also be an argument of how we position ourselves, because the mixture of reactions could also be of added value if you take the internal politics in the US. So it is a very complex equation where you need to, I think, react strongly, be ready to react strongly. And everybody knows we have things in our drawers. We know what we have to do if we want to react strongly, but we need to do it in a wise way, not to give him ammunition to then fight back and say, look, this is how they react. I always told you so. Let's be
counter-argument to that is being counter-argument to that is being tough is the only language he understands. But we'll come back on that. Fabian, you wanted to jump in there.
Just very quickly, I think one of the things which is interesting to observe is how quickly this economically illiterate approach is leading to a reduction in American power. That it is so quick that also a number of countries are much more empowered to respond strongly because it is undermining very much how America can project itself in the world.
Just to this point, Janis, that you mentioned now about differences between member states, there are different interests, as Fabian also mentioned. Ursula von der Leyen said in the immediate aftermath of the announcement of the tariffs, if you take on one of us, you take on all of us. And indeed, quite striking that for all the chumminess, if I can put it that way, between, for example, Hungary and the Trump administration, Viktor Orban and Donald Trump, they are part of this. There hasn't been an attempt to treat EU member states differently. They are being treated as a bloc. But is it true to say, if you take on one of us, you take on all of us, given we heard over the weekend quite a lot of noises, particularly from Spain and Italy, about really saying maybe we don't respond, or certainly very cautiously. Are there divisions, and can they be bridged? Can it be take on one, you take us all on?
Well, we knew that there are divisions. There have been divisions. And by the way, as we were saying earlier, if you take into account that we're talking about very different issues which are linked with each other, there are even more divisions. But having said that, I still believe that there is, at least among almost everyone, so I'm not always saying everyone, but almost everyone, there is an appreciation that there needs to be a way in which we react and push back. The question is to what extent, in which way, at what time. And here there are differences of opinion, yes. And there are some, including in Rome and in Madrid. So not only because we have a strong focus on looking into Budapest over the past weeks, there are also others who say, let's be careful, let's treat this in a way which is mature enough, which, by the way, some of them will say, let's react in a wise and mature way, which they're indirectly saying to someone who's acting very childish, who's not acting as the mature in the room, in the global room. So I think, yes, there is a readiness among the EU 27 minus X with a very small x to react jointly to this for different reasons, for different motivations. And there is this point, and you indicated that with your earlier question, that some believe that Trump is doing our job. He is helping us. So time is in our favor. Problem is that it might be in our favor when it comes to this, but on other things, it is not in our favor. So we need to be even more firm on other issues.
And of course, on this one, Fabian, I believe the legal position is when the Commission proposes trade measures, it has to be a qualified majority against to block it. So technically, you could outvote, trouble if it's a number of large member states, but a sense here, I think that they don't want to do that. They want to come to something that every member state can sign up to show that unity of purpose.
I think what we are seeing is very clearly that technically, yes, we are, of course, all in this together because trade is a European competence, and that also means that there are means of acting even if we don't have agreement. But we have always seen that in those kind of situations, there is generally an attempt to bring everyone on board, even if they are different interests. And in part, this is also to show politically that the countries are fighting for the interests of their constituents. That is, as long as we are talking about still believing in the same direction. I think the big question of what Hungary might do in that kind of situation, there it is very much possible to also have a member state outvoted. But we have also been lucky to some extent because so far at least the US government has not tried to divide and conquer. It hasn't done, for example, different tariffs for different countries. Maybe that's out of ignorance, given that there seem to be penguins targeted in this as well. I think overall there doesn't seem to be a lot of knowledge, with some people even saying that the tariffs seem to be calculated by AI rather than by any other logic. But I think this could have also been a very difficult situation for the EU if we had more favorable treatment of some countries as opposed to others.
Janis, you wanted to jump on in this, and then I want to come back to broader things that we might discuss with the US. But Janis.
Yes. Divide and conquer, that relates to the fact that what we were saying earlier, that actually the way in which this was constructed was not smart, and not only with respect to the EU, but also in more general terms. politically not smart, despite him even always arguing he's the best negotiator on this planet. But I think what is important, and I think that's something which I think all member states want to showcase, is what Fabian was saying we are all aware of, that this is an EU competence.
Yeah.
He's not aware. I assume that he doesn't even remember that Jean-Claude Juncker last time flew over, had a discussion with him, and made him understand that he's speaking for all member states and that he has the competence to speak on the behalf of all member states, which obviously is not the case when you talk about Ukraine, where you do not have that same situation. So they and he needs to be aware, reminded, whatever it might be, of the fact that we have here a totally different situation when it comes to this. And the other thing is, what he has done is not only not dividing and conquering, it's also pushing a lot of the publics in member states against him, and thus makes it difficult for those who feel themselves ideologically close to him. So, as you were indicating, Hungary, the automotive sector, is strongly hit by what he is doing. So it affects Hungarians, it affects them economically, and I could go on. And so also in other member states which feel ideologically close to him, who are aligning themselves with him, they also have to be aware that their own publics is becoming increasingly critical, but because they themselves feel what the consequences are, and they will probably feel it even more if they see that their economies, European economies, are being severely hit.
Just on a broader question, and it links to this question of the EU's competence for trade, Ursula von der Leyen also said in that first response that she was, and I quote, ready to negotiate, Fabian, to remove any remaining barriers to transatlantic trade. But given what you've both talked about in terms of how these tariffs were calculated, given Trump's accusations, among other things, that the EU was created to screw, excuse my language, his language, not mine, the US, and that this is really, it's seen by many in the Trump administration as just punishment for some perceived wrongdoing by the EU. Is a sensible, rational negotiation on any of these points even possible? I mean, Ursula von der Leyen herself has even said there is no clear path through the complexity and chaos that is being created. So how can the EU launch what might be called a sensible discussion on barriers to transatlantic trade within this context?
Well, firstly, it's important to recognize that complexity and chaos is part of the policy. This is what
it's
Trump
not great
intends.
for economies.
It's very bad for everybody, but it creates a situation where also it is difficult to respond to the latest thing coming out of the White House. But I think there's a big difference between saying we want to signal that we are the adults in the room, that we are ready to talk about these things, that we think there is a win-win situation, even if there is very little chance that the other side is going to see this. I think it is important that we make those points, but it is very, very unlikely that there is anyone within the Trump administration who would be receptive for that, even if they did understand the underlying economic logic, which they apparently don't.
And Janis, in terms of, react to that, but also let me just add, going beyond the immediate response and what we do now about this specific decision on tariffs, do you believe that the EU will really begin to align itself with other global economic partners? We've touched on Canada already today. That the way forward now is to make common cause and present a united front, not just within Europe, but more widely. And is that doable, do you think? What do you think the strategy will be looking in the bigger picture, geopolitical picture?
I think also here the picture is not a coherent one, because you might align yourself with certain other actors, and we see this happening. We see indications of that. We see also national politicians moving in and thinking in this direction and arguing in this direction. But then I come back to what I was saying earlier. Let's not forget on something which is of utmost significance from our perspective, which is Europe's geopolitical security. we still have a high dependence on them. So if there are other actors who are able to do certain things, or even think of it in a geopolitical term and think this is now their moment in which they can put pressure on the US and profit from the mistakes which the Trump 2 administration is doing, we need to be careful. So when we align ourselves, we also need to be aware of the complexity of the relationship we have with the US and the significance of, if something goes wrong, that there might be a strong price to pay. Just one addition. We do not know, to something which Fabian was responding to an earlier question you posed, we actually do not know what he fully has in his mind. Because there are those, maybe he doesn't, but there are those who argue that actually he has also in mind that he wants to strike a global deal with different partners, so not one deal, but deals with global partners when it comes to the US dollar. So he wants a depreciation of the US. It sounds somewhat unlogic, okay? But that he has that in mind. So we do not know what he has in mind. He might have some things in mind which sound crazy from our perspective, or also from a general economic perspective and from a specific US perspective. Because if this is what he has in mind, imagine what that effect might have on the financial sector in the US. Already he's undermining the confidence and also our being reliant on the US financial sector by his actions. And that is undermining the strengths of the US. So, they're talking only about trade, whereas obviously we know the picture when it comes to services, when it comes to financial interactions. Yeah. The US is a hyperpower, but it's being undermined by that.
We also talk about a lack of logic. There's a lack of logic when, on the one hand, he argues that this is designed to bring manufacturing back to the US and to reshore. And then on the other says, this is designed to make everybody else treat America better and lower their tariffs and their barriers. So there is a lack of logic on both sides. But come back to that in a moment.
It won't actually strengthen the
I want to come back to that in a moment.
Yeah,
hold that thought. I just want to ask, because I want to come to the broader implications and the big question of what all this means for globalization. But before we do that, Fabian, in terms of the risk that some of those exports from China and others that were destined for America will need to go somewhere else, do you think the EU is equipped well enough and ready enough to use the tools it has at its disposal now to avoid any dumping of those excess exports on our markets? And if not, what needs to happen?
I think if we have a situation of dumping, yes, we have the tools available. There is a difficulty with the WTO not functioning in the way it should. But still, we have managed to create instruments which can address unfair trade practices, even if necessary, in a unilateral way. But whether that is dumping is a big question. If you have product which you are selling at a reasonable price, which is not based on unfair practices in terms of subsidies, for example, then it falls under the normal trade rules. Yeah. So there is a big question also for the EU, not only for the EU, also for other countries which believe in the multilateral order, whether you can continue to play by the same rules if the big player within the whole system is no longer doing that, because it will have repercussions on the rest of the system. And I think there will have to be careful consideration and also negotiation. Anything we are doing now will be much, much stronger if it can be done in conjunction, at least with like-minded countries, so that we are having broadly the same kind of response, not differing ones.
Okay, let me start with you on this big question that I want to just address before we move on. I want to talk about Ukraine and that link that you both already made to the situation in Ukraine. But is this, without wishing to put it over dramatically, the beginning of the end, Fabian, for globalization, at least as we have known it? I.e., if Donald Trump's aim is that reshoring. And I stopped Janis there because I think he wanted to say that won't happen. And I'll let you explain why you don't think it will happen in a moment, Janis. But for you, Fabian, is it going to lead to a reshoring renaissance in America, in other parts of the world? And is it effectively a signal that the era of globalization is coming to an end? Or is that to overstate because the chaos and uncertainty that it is creating is just, at this stage, impossible to read what it really means?
We have the difficulty of not being very clear what globalization actually is. There are different elements here, and some of those are different now, and they're not going to go back to what we had before, because once you have broken the system, people don't trust the system anymore. But this does not mean that it will lead to a renaissance of US manufacturing, because for that, there are far too many other factors which will play into that. And manufacturing is very dependent on global supply chains. So it's difficult to go back to a form of autarky, which might have existed in the past. But I do think the key effect we are going to see is that, firstly, global growth is going to suffer. So we are going to see that this hurts everybody, including the US. So the cake for everybody gets smaller. And we are going to see that the international institutions are truly dead by now, because if we have this kind of sweeping tariffs, this kind of action, it's difficult to argue for anyone that there is still a rules-based system. So what we're going to see is something more chaotic, something much more mercantilistic, every country just being out on their own, politics playing a much bigger role in trade, this idea of having something which exists beyond the political interaction, the geopolitics, is clearly not on the table anymore. And we see the end of the multilateral system of trade.
And implications of that for the EU?
Quite catastrophic, because the EU has benefited enormously from both having the US in that global system and from being part of the global system, where at least to some extent there are enforceable rules. So it becomes much more difficult, and that has very direct costs. It also makes a lot of the supply chains, which Europe has, less certain, and it raises a major security concern, because Europe is very poor in certain minerals, for example, in certain resources. So this dependence on the outside world becomes even more of a factor.
Indeed. Janis, I stopped you earlier when you, I think, were about to tell me the reshoring renaissance Trump talks about will not happen. And if I'm right, why do you believe it won't? And how do you see these broader implications of a breakdown in multilateralism? And indeed, do you see it as the beginning of the end for globalization, whatever we mean by that?
Okay. First of all,
huge question.
I'll put it, yes, in a number of different ones. First of all, just make it very simple. If US cars do not sell in the European market or in other markets, will they now sell because of the tariffs? No, they won't. You don't profit even from the industries which you still have.
No, but the argument is that the Americans buy their own cars.
Yes, but look into the stock markets and look how US car producers have been affected. They are more affected now by the losses in the stock markets than others. And why? Because people are aware that this is even making them weaker, not stronger. It is actually pushing in the wrong direction. The other thing is, will the Americans themselves be ready to manufacture some of the goods which the Chinese are manufacturing, which are the manufacturing powerhouse of this world? Will they actually want to do this? Will they be ready to do it? which also, by the way, has a number of, including also environmental consequences if you do it. I'm just giving you concrete examples of something which theoretically will not work. So what he's having in mind doesn't work. And as I said earlier, it's undermining those economic sectors which are very strong. And what Fabian was referring to, the loss of confidence, if there's a loss of confidence in the US, and also if loss of confidence in the US as a financial powerhouse, that is at the most expense of the US itself. So it doesn't work in the manufacturing area, but it economically makes also no sense from a US perspective in other sectors. And all this is not good news for the rest of the world. This is not a zero-sum game, they lose, we win. And maybe some will profit more, but from us Europeans, obviously, we are not profiting from that. But the logic which he has in mind, and those who are advocating in the direction of what he is then following, is that chaos and uncertainty and increasing nationalism, also economic nationalism, is in their interest because they believe that they are the powerhouse, that no one will profit more from the chaos than themselves. That's the wrong logic. But so how do you interact with someone who follows that wrong logic? That might help, that sounds now a bit strange, that might help the Democrats who are in a very dire situation. That's why it might sound strange. But it will not help the situation which we are not looking at it from a European perspective. So the entire logic makes no sense, and there's a heavy price to be paid for that. From
someone in our audience just coming back at you on that. Stéphane Legrand says, what if the US is able to automate the manufacturing of manufacturing goods traditionally built by China? They have the technology and it could be part of the wider plan. Their technological advantage is huge. So is there a way in which they can do this?
Well, you're asking me or asking?
Yeah, no, Stéphane's asking you because you.
Okay.
In response to what you just said,
I think it can compensate, but that would assume that the ones who are you competing with, and I was talking about China being the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, are not able to do that. They are able to do that. We're not where we were 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So the others, in this case, China as the powerhouse when it comes to manufacturing, are able to counter also along the lines of your potential technological advantages. But actually the advantages with the US has, and it can exploit much more, not in the manufacturing area, but in the tech sector and so forth. So even that doesn't really, it doesn't make sense.
Okay, Fabian, you wanted to react on that, and also to a comment, if you would, from Maciek. I'm going to mispronounce your surname, Maciek, so I'm not going to try. Should the EU, we talked about working with like-minded global partners on this, and Maciek asks, should the EU coordinate its response with other countries like Japan, South Korea, Brazil? Should there be rather a democratic-like-minded pushback?
Just firstly on the economics of this.
Yeah.
We have known for a very long time that in the world of trade, comparative advantage means that you produce whatever it is in the place where it's best produced. And if you are going to alter that by tariffs, you're going to incur a cost. It's as simple as that. And we are going to see that cost is incurred. But unfortunately, because of the position of the US in the global economy, it's a cost which is imposed both on the US and its trading partners. In terms of like-minded, I would make a difference here. I think there's a difference between like-minded and common interests. There are a number of countries which share common interests with the EU, but there are only a small number of countries which I would say are truly like-minded. Basically, like-minded means we're sitting in the same boat, whereas common interest means we're going broadly in the same direction. So I think there's a scope for working together with like-minded countries, and there I'm thinking particularly of countries like Canada, like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, the countries which have also worked together in the past, but with the US as being the guiding point there. I think these have to work together very closely, but that doesn't mean we should exclude working with countries where we share common interests. And countries like India, for example, and Brazil have become much more important now for Europe. And that is also why Mercosur, for example, is absolutely crucial now.
I want to now move on and pick up on something, Janis, I think you mentioned first in our discussion earlier about the link with the situation in Ukraine. And the fact that when we were talking about the calm, measured response, not panicking, not overreacting, you both really implied that one of the reasons for that is because we need the Americans when it comes to Ukraine. How do you see the impact on all of this, if there is a direct one, on Ukraine, on the peace negotiations, so-called peace negotiations that Trump is conducting, and indeed on EU unity on the issue of Ukraine?
First of all, it has a direct impact, and both Fabian and I were already indicating that. The question is, where does it have the strongest direct impact? With what he's now doing, and if you put yourself into the position of Moscow and Putin, if you put yourself in the position of Xi and Beijing, would you assume that what Trump is doing is actually countering the interests of the US, making it more difficult for the US to impose things on us in the mid to long term? Is it undermining the position of the US? If this is the position you have, and I think that's what the prevailing assumption is, time is in your interest. So you just need to wait. They will do things in a way which will harm them meaning the US and the traditional Old West, which means that from our perspective, in the current situation, including what is now happening in front of our eyes, we need to be aware that, yes, we need the Americans, as we have said now a couple of times, but we also mid and long term, even more now than 2 weeks ago, need to be ready to do what it takes to be autonomous enough to deal with what will come in 3 or 5 or 7 years' time. Because that's the time span with others, in this case, Putin, as an adversary when it comes to Ukraine, the war in Ukraine and Europe's security, is thinking. So he thinks that the time is on my side. We need to counter that. That, I think, is the big challenge. Whether will we be able to do that? Because, and we've discussed that in the past, there will be a lot of trade-offs. Something else which is concrete, because you were asking about this, relates to Ukraine itself. You know? Because if the situation now worsens, the negotiations lead nowhere, if you even want to call them negotiations. And I think that with what is now happening in front of our eyes, even more Putin will try to drag things out because he thinks that time is on his side. The push will become stronger with respect to how we are going to accommodate the fact that there will not be a solution, but we need to provide for a solution which will help the Ukrainians in a way which is much stronger than that before. And that relates, for example, to the question also of EU enlargement.
Well, I want to come to that because, Fabian, you wrote a commentary published today entitled "The Moment of Truth for Ukraine's Accession," and you argue there that the time has come for the EU, and I quote, to force the pace and allow Kyiv to join more quickly. You say it would be complicated, contentious, and face legal challenges, but it can and should be made to work. Why, at this moment, do you believe it is imperative to accelerate that process? And then I want to come to the broader question of enlargement more generally, but to your commentary today, Fabian.
Having Ukraine as a member state is geopolitical. It is an imperative at this moment in time. However, just because something must done doesn't mean it is being done. And the way we have dealt with the enlargement process, the way we've dealt with Ukraine in particular, implies that there is going to be a lot of time which needs to pass. It is a process. We haven't seriously looked at the reforms inside the EU. So all of this leads to a situation where the danger is very high that we continue to just postpone accession to some point in the future, and we don't have that time. We have to become much more decisive now. But I'm not naive. I don't believe that this is necessarily going to work. But that is also why I think we need to force the pace now. to be able to say, is it going to happen or is it not going to happen? And if it's not going to happen, we have to have a plan B.
Okay. To broaden that out, and Janis, please do react on the specific issue of Ukraine, but Antonio Costa gave a speech at the European Policy Centre last week. And in that speech, one of the things he talked about was the role of enlargement as a tool to enhance Europe's power and security. He called it, and I quote, the greatest geostrategic achievement of the European Union together with peace. Do you believe this current geopolitical context, both in relation to the war in Ukraine and relation to global trade wars and etc., will also impact among the member states on the thinking on enlargement more broadly?
It should. Is it? Will it? We'll see, but it should. And I think we need to anticipate the fact that we have to move in this direction, meaning becoming serious when it comes to enlargement. And I believe not only with respect to Ukraine, that we actually do some of the things which we consider to be thus far either not in our interest, which some think, or not doable because it's impossible for the EU to digest. I think that both these approaches are wrong. Now, we should not be naive, as Fabian said. This is extremely difficult. It will require a lot of efforts, by the way, on behalf of Ukraine and others who want to join, but also on behalf of us in terms of ourselves preparing for it, both for enlargement, but also the other side of the coin, reform. However, I think this is something which actually we have in many ways in our own hands. If we decide that we want to do this, if we are convinced that we want to do this, if we have finally understood that 22 February was a watershed moment and November 5 was a watershed moment, that we also need to move ourselves when it comes to enlargement and reform. Now, does that mean we know where we will end? Who will join, when they will join, under which conditions they will join, what we need to do in terms of reform? No, but we need to become serious about this process, because thus far I still hear a lot of Sunday speeches talking about the enlargement imperative, the geopolitical imperative of enlargement, and then also aligning that also to reform. Let's not forget Costa also at the PC answering to a question said that when we enlarge, we also need to reform ourselves. So it will also happen. But are we preparing for this? We're not, because we're still thinking potentially we can get around it, because maybe we can circumvent it. Maybe we can find a way to accommodate Ukraine in one way or the other without it becoming a member. Maybe we can accommodate also our neighbors in the Western Balkans in a way which undermines the fact that Russia is becoming stronger and stronger, also China, by the way, in that region, which is within Europe, obviously, but also if you look at it geographically, look at the map, it's a black spot in between different member states and non-member states. So we need to become serious. And are we becoming serious? I don't see that we're becoming serious yet. So that is something which needs to be pushed also in the debate and needs to be understood also with respect to the overall future of the EU. Now, if you ask for Ukraine to be fast-tracked, for example, would this be enough? I would assume no. We should not only talk about Ukraine. We need to talk about enlargement in broader perspectives. But if it doesn't happen, because some member states do not want this to happen, and we'll come back to things which we have been discussed in the past, and let's not forget that there's a unanimity requirement when it comes to enlargement. How do we deal with that? And that is already something we need to deal with now.
Let me come back on that point, but hang on, just to stay with one thing. So I know that you and colleagues are working on a paper at the moment looking at enlargement and reform. You're looking at strategic options for enlargement. You're looking at strategic reform options and the connections between the two. A paper to be published in anticipation of a communication from the Council on this topic towards the end of May. Maciek, the man with the surname whose I cannot pronounce, asks now, how much internal reform is the EU ready to digest over the next 4 years? Should we start the treaty reform process before the European elections of 2029? Do you sense, partly in response to the events that we're seeing now and the scale of the challenge we face, a growing appetite to make sure that the EU is reformed for enlargement, but also for its capacity to act in this incredibly challenging geopolitical context. Do you sense any mood change there, Janis?
A growing appetite? No. A growing necessity and awareness for potentially becoming a growing necessity? Yes. But what do we actually mean? Because in the question now by Maciek, there was already an indication of treaty change. Must there be treaty change? Let's have a discussion about actually what is required, which is open, where we take into account all the potential avenues that can be, that we can move on when it comes to reforming. If you look, for example, in some of the things which now are strongly affecting the debate, the Draghi report, the Letta report, the preparedness debate which we're having. When it comes to governance, all these reports were rather weak because they feared that if we highlight these aspects, that will undermine what we're asking in concrete policy terms, because people, member states, EU leaders do not have an appetite to reform the European Union. So we need thinking in terms of what we need to change in terms of the EU's, I now call it operating system, in terms of how it needs to be modernized, how it needs to be reformed, which can span from technical adjustments which are possible on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty, and potentially also things which are not possible in the context of the Lisbon Treaty, because I am fully convinced that the EU is neither enlargement nor future nor crisis-proof on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty. The question is, what do we need to do within the EU framework and potentially, and that is also another big question, outside the EU framework?
Thank you. Lots of questions now coming in from our audience. And indeed, now Helga Schmidt bringing up the question of the Balkan countries and the lack of progress of the last decade or so, very few chapters closed, and saying, wouldn't it be more realistic to simply offer the countries complete access to the single market as an alternative to being in the club or being on the outside? We haven't got time to go into this in depth, but in terms, Fabian, of the imperative enlargement and that link between the two. And I'm wondering here about your repeated calls since last year, you, Fabian, and also with your colleague Muller, for what you have called a supra-governmental avant-garde, coalitions of the willing, to move ahead in some areas if they cannot bring everyone with them. Janis just alluded to it there. The links between all these different conversations.
What we're seeing at the moment, as Janis was describing, is difficulties with the operating system of the European Union. It is impossible to make progress on some crucial areas with every country on board. If at all, we can only make progress by sacrificing ambition, by not going as far as we need to. But in the current situation, that just leads us into the progress illusion, not actually doing enough to deal with the scale and scope of the problem. So the only alternative is coalitions of the willing, but we have to be careful how we design them. And that is really what we were trying to do in our paper, is to say, yes, we should be going down this route, but there are ways we can design that to make it as compatible, as forward-looking as possible. But also, and I think this is a crucial point, and it relates to a question Malcolm was raising in the Q&A as well. It doesn't necessarily mean all EU countries are in, but it also means that in certain areas, non-EU countries can be in, including also accession countries.
Yeah, Malcolm was referring here to the UK and Brexit and the degree to which the UK should be engaged. And Janis, of course, to that point, there is new talk of a European defence mechanism for common buying of military equipment, which would involve the UK. Is that the sort of thing we should be talking about? This would be outside of the EU framework. Is that the sort of thing we should be talking about?
Okay, I think we're already talking about different things happening outside the European Union. And let's not forget, we were trying to push this discussion since last summer. Now we see that there is more of a discussion about coalitions of the willing. However, what I'm seeing is that it is not following the logic which we have had in mind when we talk about an open super intergovernmental avant-garde.
Yeah.
because it is undermining potentially some of the core principles we talk about, which is to make sure that you do not undermine the competences, the powers, and the role of EU institutions. And yes, we've done these things in the past. You were referring to the ESM. We have done it also on other occasions, but we need to be careful that what is now on the table, especially when it comes to defense, that action is undermining the EU as such, because that could have big repercussions for how the EU operates. So yes, we need coalitions of the willing, but we need to think carefully through of how they're being constructed. And what we see from a good number of member states is when it comes to defense, they are very worried that the Commission will grab more power. So that it could be used as an opportune moment to undermine that with the logic, we need to do things, we need to involve also non-EU countries, that makes it difficult. With the EU institution, let's do it. So there is a danger here.
Okay, I want to come back. I hope we can come back in an update and spend a lot more time. We always touch on this idea of the super-governmental avant-garde, but now we're beginning to dig into the detail of how it might work and what it shouldn't do. Perhaps come back to that in more depth at a future update. A couple of questions about the impact of all of this on the EU's internal market, and one other I want to take, and then I wanted to ask you a broader question about the role of think tanks. But Fabian, the two questions on the internal market. Philip Hammer-Drott saying the internal market of the EU is the motor of the EU. Would the new global situation and US policy have an impact on the internal market? And if so, how and how soon? And someone else asking, should we not strengthen the internal market and arrive at a further deepening of EU cohesion? And they're linking this to the question of enlargement. Impact of all of this on the internal market, Fabian, briefly, if you would.
Very briefly, clearly, it has a major impact on the internal market. Some positive effects as well, but also a lot of negative effects. And yes, it does open the route to also using the single market more strategically. But for me, the big question remains, we knew that we had to do all of these things before Trump's announcement, before all of this happened. And we didn't do it. We just have to look at the Draghi report, at the Letter report. We just have to look at the change in mindset, which is really what is in all of that. And we haven't managed to do that. Does this give a new impetus to some extent? But it also means any action takes place in an environment with higher costs. And higher costs also have political implications. So it becomes more difficult for each country to move beyond just looking on the impact on its own, to look at how does that affect all of us together.
Okay, thank you. And Janis, I don't know whether you can help us with this question from George Kasimakis, who talks about, he says, a number of people are increasingly vocal about the use of the anti-coercion instrument as a possible way forward to address the current situation, referring here to the instrument that was designed as a response to the rising problem of economic coercion, aiming to protect the interests and sovereign choices of the Union and its member states. He's asking here, is this so-called nuclear option, the use of the ACI, advisable, politically feasible? And what, in your view, would be the expected response from the Trump administration? Can you help us from that? George is from the Council. What is your sense of whether this instrument can be used or not, to the degree you are an expert in the instrument or not?
I think that, and I know you want to go also to another question. I think one could, in theory, use it. I think and that goes back to something we were discussing in the beginning, using it in the current context might potentially be not in our political interest. And also economically, it can actually lead in the wrong direction, but it can also politically lead in the wrong direction because of all the dependence we have on the US. So I think we need to be careful. So in theory, why not? In practice, be very careful when it comes to this.
Okay, but it does indeed talk about a calibrated response. So within it, there may be ways to do it, which does not cause the damage you fear. Okay, I did want to come just before we close to a broader question, because you sent a letter to the Friends of the EPC last week, an email about the role of the think tanks in this incredibly challenging moment, a moment you call one of existential change. Why do you believe, Fabian, if I can ask you, I know you have a train to catch, so I'm going to come to you first. Why do you believe, as you say in the letter, the role of think tanks is, and I'm quoting, more critical than ever? And what challenges does what you call a shrinking democratic space pose for you and other think tanks in playing this role? Why did you feel moved to write that letter?
Well, firstly, I think in the current situation, clearly there are many fundamental challenges which require different responses than what we had in the past. So this is very much where think tanks can be helpful and can also start conversations which politicians find increasingly difficult to have, even in private, even behind closed doors. But it is also the case that we have to operate within this framework. And that means that we are also targets for those who do not believe in liberal democracy, who do not believe in the kind of processes which the EPC has been supporting for a long time, including, of course, European integration as well. So it does put a big challenge on the institution, but also a big challenge on individuals. The targeting here does actually affect also individuals. And we are already experiencing this in a number of different ways. So it is more challenging, but we thought collectively, and this is a letter from all of EPC, including our governance, we thought collectively it is important to show where the EPC stands and what is the choice we are making, what are the trade-offs we are making in this current situation with all the costs that also implies.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you run because I know you're on a very tight schedule to catch your train. Thank you very much. See you next time. And let me turn to Janis really on that same question as Fabian leads us in terms of the role of think tanks right now and how best they can play that role. What do you see as the challenge for you as think tanks?
Well, first of all, I think that the challenges, some of them are not new. Look into the situation which some think tanks have already been experiencing, by the way, within the EU member states. If you look into the, for some time at least, the Polish case, if you look into the Hungarian case, and also other civil society actors. So this is not only about think tanks, but also if you look into the situation in non-EU countries, we were talking about enlargement earlier on, we were talking about Western Balkans. If you hear of how some of our colleagues, under which conditions they're operating, for example, of Serbia. And I could also mention other examples. So this is something which it has been developing, has been also in place in a good number of places in Europe. And I think we're witnessing that it's becoming more difficult. It's becoming more difficult to operate. And by the way, it's not only the illiberal forces or those who have other values and principles in mind also think about the EU and the EU's future in a different way. If you look at those who are talking about Occupy Brussels, which obviously have a different idea in mind, it's also forces which are more in the center, in the mainstream, who self-identify themselves, and also I identify them as liberal democratic actors, who are actually arguing as to whether the role of think tanks, of civil society organization, is the right one, who are raising questions with respect to whether think tanks are operating along the lines of, and other civil society organizations are operating along the lines they should be acting. Look into, in Germany, the CDU-CSU, look into the EPP in the European Parliament, who are pushing some of these actors, including think tanks. And I think that is actually undermining not only the role of think tanks, but it's undermining our system. It's undermining our principles, our values, and it's playing into exactly the hands of those who want to undermine these principles, who want to undermine liberal democracy. So I think with our letter, we tried to the friends of the EPC, but also beyond that, we tried to not only say, what are the problems we're now facing, how we as EPC are confronting that, and also calling on others who feel themselves under pressure to align with what we are doing and what others are going to join forces, because we need to also join forces.
Thank you very much indeed. That is all we have time for. Apologies to Isaac Helaman. I didn't get to your raised hands, but we will be coming back, I am sure, on all of these issues in future updates. So please do join us again, and we'll have a chance, I hope, to address your question then. Links to that commentary we talked about the moment of truth for Ukraine's accession, and to that EPC letter, which, as Fabian said, came from the governance of the EPC, the entire EPC. Links to all of those in the chat. One event to flag up to you, lots of things coming up at the EPC, but in particular, on the 5th and 6th of June, the inaugural meeting of the Brussels Economic Security Forum, registration now open for that one, and you'll be looking out, I hope, for that paper on enlargement and reform coming soon. To a website near you, as they say. Janis, thank you. Fabian in his absence, thank you. Thank you, as always, to all of you for joining us. If you're in Brussels, enjoy this remarkable spell of sunshine, and we will see you at the end of the month for another update. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.